What if I told you that one of Britain's kings, born into unimaginable privilege, became so lost in his own excesses that he literally ate himself to death? That he grew so bloated and broken, even his closest servants could barely dress him each morning? This is not fiction. This is the nightmarish, almost unbelievable story of King George IV's final years, a king whose journey from dazzling prince to grotesque monarch is one of the darkest tales ever to haunt the British throne. Today, we're peeling back the velvet curtains on one of the most tragic and unsettling royal downfalls in history. If you're drawn to the darker side of power, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on, because what you're about to hear will linger with you long after the credits roll. To understand George IV's horrific decline, we first need to see the man he was before the ruin. Imagine London in the 1780s. The air thick with perfume and ambition, the drawing rooms filled with laughter and intrigue. Into this world steps George, Prince of Wales, the very picture of aristocratic charm. Tall, striking, witty, and magnetic, he was Europe's darling, the poster boy of the Georgian age. His dark curls, sparkling eyes, and easy grace made him the heartthrob of an entire continent. Artists fought to capture his image. Poets wrote odes to his beauty. But beneath the gilded surface, there was a fatal flaw, an appetite for pleasure that knew no bounds. Food, drink, gambling, love affairs, George never denied himself a single indulgence. And why should he? As heir to the greatest throne in the world, there was no pleasure too forbidden, no luxury out of reach. But absolute freedom, as history shows us time and again, is often the seed of absolute destruction. Fast forward to 1820, when his long-suffering father George III finally dies, George steps onto the throne. Already a man battered and broken by his own excesses. By 1827, King George IV is a living cautionary tale. He weighs nearly 300 pounds, but numbers alone cannot capture the spectacle of his suffering. His legs are so swollen with dropsy, fluid retention caused by heart failure, that they resemble ancient tree trunks. His hands, once elegant, are now bloated, the fingers too stiff and fat to hold a pen. Even the most basic royal rituals, dressing, bathing, sitting, have become titanic struggles. His personal wardrobe, reinforced with multiple corsets, each one groaning and creaking as servants cinch them tight, fighting a losing battle against his swelling flesh. Every step, every movement, is a performance of pain. The horror goes deeper, into his daily routines: breakfast, 2 whole pigeons, 3 steaks, thick slices of bread, and a half bottle of brandy, washed down with champagne. That's just the start of his day. Lunch and dinner follow in the same vein. Meat piled upon meat, rivers of alcohol. By nightfall, he's often consumed enough spirits to kill an ordinary man, yet he demands more. His doctors, trapped in the old ways of medicine, bleed him and apply leeches, hoping to draw out his sickness. They administer mercury, hoping to purge his body, leaving him trembling, feverish, confused. Nothing helps. At this point, the king was a prisoner, trapped not in a tower, but in a body ruled by appetite and addiction. Every meal was comfort, every bite was a slow act of self-destruction. For pain, he takes laudanum, an opium tincture so strong it stains his lips a deep, unnatural purple-black, leaving him dazed, shuffling through his days in a narcotic fog. Yet the physical nightmare pales in comparison to what's unfolding in his mind. In the lonely, echoing halls of Windsor and Brighton, the king grows ever more isolated, and ever more paranoid. He spends endless hours rearranging his beloved collection of miniatures, fussing over minute details, as if he can restore order to a collapsing world with tiny painted faces. He's convinced there are plots against him everywhere. Every dish, every cup of wine, must be tasted in front of witnesses. He's terrified of being poisoned, never realizing that the real poison is his own lifestyle. The dazzling prince who once threw the wildest parties in Europe now hides in locked chambers, curtains drawn tight, refusing to face daylight or visitors. Servants sometimes find him slumped in his chair, surrounded by empty bottles and discarded food, mumbling to portraits of long-dead lovers. His marriage to Queen Caroline has long since disintegrated, An epic scandal played out in the public eye, their mutual loathing splashed across newspapers and caricatures. His secret love, Maria Fitzherbert, is banished from court. He is utterly alone, with only sycophants and flatterers to keep him company, men who enable his worst impulses, never daring to speak hard truths. By 1829, George IV was perhaps the most hated monarch Britain had ever known. He went from beloved prince to grotesque pariah, all in one lifetime. Outside the palace, Britain is changing. The Industrial Revolution is reshaping society, and the people are restless. As hunger and hardship stalk the land, their king becomes a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. The newspapers, freed from government control, are merciless. Cartoons portray George as a bloated pig, wallowing in filth, his crown perched atop a mountain of meat. Street songs mock his gluttony, children jeer as his carriage passes. He becomes the butt of jokes, the villain in every political scandal. His spending is obscene. While ordinary families starve, George pours vast fortunes into redecorating palaces, buying jewels, and throwing private banquets. The government is forced to raise taxes to pay off his debts so large, they threaten the stability of the crown itself. By 1830, the end is unmistakable. King George IV is dying, slowly, painfully, and in almost total isolation. His heart, battered by years of excess, is giving out. Gout has turned his hands and feet into twisted, agonized claws. The dropsy is so severe that his skin oozes fluid, the swelling so great that he cannot lie flat to sleep. At night he sometimes wakes from his stupor and glimpses the truth in a mirror, not a king, not a god, but a ruined, monstrous man. These moments of clarity are brief, but brutal. He becomes terrified of his own reflection, terrified of visitors, terrified of death. No family gathers at his bedside. The courtiers who remain do so only out of duty, not affection. The last days of George IV were a slow-motion collapse. The once resplendent halls of Windsor were silent, thick with the smell of sickness, opium, sweat, decay. The king's body had become his prison, swollen to grotesque proportions. He could barely move, barely breathe. Even turning in bed required the strength of multiple servants, and left him gasping, his heart hammering against layers of suffocating flesh. Doctors came and went, offering little more than laudanum and false hope. The windows remained shuttered, blocking out the midsummer light. Courtiers whispered in the corridors, trading rumors of the king's agony, the stench from his rooms, the gurgling rattle in his chest. There were no sons or beloved daughters at his side. No queen, no old friends. Just servants, resentful, exhausted, waiting for the inevitable. On the morning of June 26, 1830, just after 3 a.m., George IV finally slipped away. There was no last speech, no words of wisdom or repentance. He died as he had lived his final years, alone, bloated by excess, drifting into oblivion behind closed curtains. In those last moments he was not a king, but simply a ruined man, brought down not by war or conspiracy, but by his own relentless appetites. News of his death spread with unnatural speed, but instead of grief, there was a palpable sense of relief. The court received it with cool efficiency, plans for succession already in motion. Across London and the nation, there were few tears and no outpouring of public mourning. Many simply shrugged. Some celebrated. The Times wrote, with a bluntness rarely reserved for royalty, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. If George's death was pitiful, his funeral was little better." Protocol demanded the trappings of royal dignity: black-draped carriages, soldiers in mourning dress, muffled drums beating a slow dirge through Windsor's grey dawn. The body, sealed in an enormous lead-lined coffin to contain the smell, was laid out for an audience that never really materialized. Gone were the crowds that had thronged the streets for his father's passing. Gone were the sea of candles, the rivers of flowers. Instead, a cold formality hung in the air. Foreign ambassadors paid their respects, but with a certain distance, aware that this was less a moment of reverence than a closing of a painful chapter. There was no genuine grief in the faces of the nobility, no hush of national sorrow. In Parliament, the mood was cautious, even businesslike. No one wanted to dwell on the reign just ended, everyone was eager to move on. The streets of Windsor were quiet. For the first time in centuries, the death of a British king failed to unite his people in mourning. As the funeral cortege wound its way to St. George's Chapel, a sense of unfinished business clung to the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was not just a burial, but an exorcism of shame. George IV's legacy was so toxic that even in death, he was a reminder of how far a crown can fall. Inside the chapel, the Archbishop mumbled the familiar words, but they rang hollow. The final prayers were recited not with reverence, but with relief. When the vault closed over the king's bloated remains, there was no collective sigh of loss, only the faint hope that the monarchy itself might recover. In the weeks that followed, life in Britain quickly resumed. There was no outpouring of nostalgia, no wistful longing for the departed king. His brother William IV was crowned with little fanfare. His greatest asset, perhaps, was simply not being George. George left behind palaces filled with debts, a throne stripped of dignity, and a memory many longed to erase. His burial was less a royal farewell than a warning, echoing through history: even the mightiest can fall, and sometimes, the world moves on with startling speed. History has not forgiven George IV. He is remembered not for his taste in art, not for the palaces he built or the parties he hosted, but for his extraordinary weakness, his absolute surrender to appetite, vanity, and excess. What can we learn from the tragic spectacle of George IV? Beneath the glitter and scandal was a deeply human story, of a man who could not, or would not, master himself. He inherited a crown, but never earned the respect or love that comes with true leadership. His story is a warning: privilege without discipline is a curse, not a blessing. Power without self-control destroys not just the individual, but everything and everyone around them. George's greatest legacy is as a living lesson, proof that the mightiest can fall, and that true greatness begins not with privilege, but with character. Now I want to hear from you. Was George IV doomed by his upbringing and circumstances, or was he the architect of his own destruction? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story as fascinating and horrifying as I did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more journeys into history's darkest corners. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.